everyone, and welcome to the Ultimate Job Search and Career Podcast. I am Bill, the company's expert, and today we're going to talk about unintuitive job interview questions. And do you have to be a mind reader to get these right? Now, today's episode is based on two questions that were sent in to me by two of my awesome listeners/viewers who sent in some intelligent questions. And the first is from somebody called, TDYYR Love. So that's an awesome name. TDY Your Love, I think that's supposed to be. Anyway, oh my God, I have to say it again. TDYYR Love says, they didn't give you the opportunity to speak freely, quote unquote. That's probably the best advice for a hiring manager conducting interviews. Most interviewers come in with a list of questions. Very few interviews allow a candidate to shine with how they are a great fit. Some interviewers will start with, "Tell me about yourself," which allows the candidate to speak freely. Unfortunately, many candidates do not answer this question properly. A well-trained candidate will frame every response with a sample of something they encountered, how they acted, and the positive outcomes from their decisions or procedures. Okay, so this is more of a statement than a question, but there's a couple of things I want to unpack here. First of all, I'm just going to call the person TDR Love. Says, okay, very few interviewers allow a candidate to shine with how they are a great fit. Well, at a lower level, yes, that's true. When you are hiring for entry-level jobs and worker-level jobs, yes, that may be true. The job interviews take the format of very cookie-cutter, question and answer, interrogation style type interviews. And they don't allow the candidate to speak freely and sell themselves. They are required to give very specific answers about very specific things. Now, generally, those type of interviews, if the assertion is that that's how you interview someone, I disagree. I've taught recruiters, and no, this is not really a gold standard of interviewing. That is how some organizations in this day and age like to interview, but that is not really a great test of it's not really going to reveal who is a great candidate and who is not. And once again, if you disagree with me on that, the litmus test is looking at employee retention and seeing if the people they're choosing end up outperforming and staying there, or they end up underperforming and leaving. Okay. So if you doubt me on this, go look up some of that data, and that can reveal whether they're doing a good job in selecting the right people. Okay. Now, when you get to higher level interviews, if you're interviewing someone who's going to be a manager of, say, 50 employees and, $2 million annual revenue, in those interviews, they're going to let you speak freely. It would be weird if they didn't, okay? It's going to be all about what you can bring and why your approach is the right approach for this particular situation, okay? And it's usually not going to be done by a recruiter. It's going to be done by some form of hiring manager, some person who's probably the boss of the role that they're recruiting for, okay? So don't feel that, asking very cookie cutter questions and having it be an interrogation is necessarily the best way to assess a candidate, because it isn't. Usually that method is taught or is policy in a lot of organizations because A, they want consistency between recruiters, B, they want consistency when putting candidates side by side, and C, they don't trust the recruiters to assess a person. So they're removing your ability to assess a person, and they're giving you a sort of answer key like methodology to select someone. That's usually what's going on there. Now the other aspect of what my buddy TDY Your Love says is the tell me about yourself question. Okay, a well-trained candidate will frame every response with a sample of something they encountered, how they acted, and the positive outcomes of their decisions and procedures. Well, okay, now this is echoing something that is sometimes taught in recruitment and selection. But once again, that's not a rule. I know there are some recruiters out there, and there are some influencers that will give me an argument on this, but this is yet another example of what I wanted to talk about. This is where doing a job interview becomes a thing in itself, meaning that there's this code of conduct in a job interview where the recruiters are not making their expectations clear, and they're relying on the candidate to be a mind reader to know things like this, okay? So the assertion is that if they ask a general question like, tell me about yourself, you're supposed to know precisely the specific information that they are requesting, and you have to have the intuition to give them the specific information that they're really wanting to know, okay? Now, that concept, although generally true, you can't take it past a certain point, okay? If you're going to ask a question like, tell me about yourself, which is completely general, you can't be asking it expecting for a very specific answer. You can't say, well, I was expecting you to tell me about your previous job, and you didn't, so you failed the question. That's ridiculous, okay? A lot of recruiters think this way. They think that the questions that they're asking are intuitive when they're not, okay? Now, the response from a lot of candidates or anyone who's been put through this kind of test is to think, well, look, if you wanted that specific information, why didn't you ask me about that specific information? How was I to know that you're asking about that specifically? There was no indication, nor was it clear from context clues that you are asking about that specific information, okay? You didn't ask me about my previous job. You asked me to tell me about me. So I'm telling you about me and what I felt was the most pertinent information to this role, you know? So this is the danger. And this is what's driving a movement. I don't know how big it is, but it's a movement where you can train someone to pass an interview, yet have them be a very poor candidate for the position. And this is increasingly well known that this is happening. Okay, so this is very dangerous, in my opinion. TDY, your love is not wrong, but because he or she is describing how a lot of recruiters think. My point is that this type of thinking does not yield to a better evaluation of a candidate's essential points when you do this. Okay. Now, to this point, there was another question that was sent in, and I'm having problems bringing it up. Here we go. Okay. Now, this question is from Alice Kwan. Okay. Alice Kwan says, as I was taught in HR communication module, a qualified HR manager should ask an open-closed question and not an open question like, tell me about yourself. It should be, tell me about yourself starting from, and then fill in the blank. I get turned off when an HR manager wasn't properly trained. Well, okay. My reaction to this is, it could be, okay? From the point I just stated, okay, the problem with these general questions is that if you're expecting a very specific answer, okay, and the person doesn't give you a specific answer to a general question, that's bad. You can't ask a general question expecting a specific answer. But if you're asking a general question expecting a general answer, that's perfectly okay. There's no reason why you can't do that. For example, if someone says, what's the most important trait you have? Something like that. Okay. I mean, that could be anything. That could be how tall you are. It could be your background. It could be your education. It could be a specific life event. It could be job experience. It could be your approach to working, or your opinions on something. right? I mean, you know what I mean? It could be anything, right? It's a very general question. They're not asking about something extremely specific here. Okay. And you may wish to ask this type of question to see in the mind of the candidate what they feel is the most important thing needed for this job and what they can bring to it. Okay. Now that's revealing very important information that's pertinent to the role, and it's pertinent to their assessment as the most qualified candidate. But it still is in the form of a general question. Okay. You know, they're not asking, tell me about your, or they're not asking, tell me what's your most important trait as it relates to the job, and it's something that's based on a life experience or an opinion you had. Like, you know what I mean? That would be a more specific question. Okay. So here's my point. A lot of recruiters like to create these hard and fast rules. Okay. And as we've seen in this case, you know, Alice Kwan is saying people shouldn't ask, tell me about yourself. They should ask a more specific question. Well, the reality is, regardless of your opinion on it, tell me about yourself is still one of the most, common job interview questions. When you go to a job interview, you can expect to be asked this in some way, shape, or form. You know, they might say, introduce yourself or tell us a little about yourself. Okay, that's still very common, and it's used as the icebreaker. People read too much into these cookie cutter questions. These, in my years of experience interviewing people, using questions like this and using more advanced methods where you actually get to know the candidate, these are not the be-all, end-all that a lot of recruiters seem to think they are. The margin of error on job interviews is incredibly high. And I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this in the podcast before, but they did a study many years ago. I think it was from Harvard or somewhere like this, where they had two groups. They had a group of candidates that were selected by some of the highest paid management consulting firms in New York. Okay. On the one hand, and then these people were hired, and then they went to work for like 6 months or something, and they were assessed after 6 months. The other group was a group of candidates that were selected at random. Okay, there were some companies that participated in this experiment. They chose candidates at random and hired them. And then they assessed their performance after 6 months. So after 6 months, these two groups were compared. And what everybody was expecting to see was the group that was handpicked by the most expensive management consulting companies in New York. You were expecting them to totally outperform the other group of candidates that were selected at random. Well, they did, but they only did by a very, very small margin. Whatever the assessment method was, I don't have that information, but it was something like a 2% spread in effectiveness between these two groups. So a lot of so what that essentially said was that all the methodology, all the interview questions, and all the mechanisms for, determining the suitability of, who's the optimal of the candidates and who's the optimal candidate, that only results in the best case of a 2% higher performance than if you just selected people at random. So what that means is that job interviews are really, really ineffective. We are terrible as humans at assessing other people when you're doing a job interview, because a job interview is essentially I want to understand someone without putting in the time to understand them. And it shows you how ineffective a lot of the stuff is. And I see this every day when you get people that are super qualified and valuable, talented people that can't find a job because they can't pass a job interview. And then you can train them to pass an interview, and all of a sudden they're hired. And conversely, I've seen people that are really not very good employees and not very good. They don't have a lot of skills, and their soft skills are not really there. And you can train these people to pass an interview, and they pass an interview and they get hired. And it's silly. The performance in an interview is independent of your performance as an employee across the board. This is what I've seen firsthand. And I've worked across 5 industries, and it's been the same at multiple levels. So making a lot of these little rules, like you have to ask this particular question, you can't ask that question, they're really not as important as people think. And a lot of these job interviews are completely ineffective anyway. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, the alternative to doing this is actually getting to know a client or a candidate, I should say. That's the alternative. Now, that takes a lot more time, okay? If you were to spend collectively 3 or 4 hours with a candidate, you would get to know them pretty damn well. You ask them about their entire life. You talk to them in an environment that's a little bit more disarming, okay? It's not like a police interrogation. And usually you can really get a glimpse into who that person is and how much they know their stuff. And that's usually how job interviews are done at a higher level, okay? Once the recruiters have done the initial filtering and then the hiring managers come in, and that's what they end up doing. And it's so much more effective than doing this stuff. So that's something I want to say. You need to be aware of these silly little rules. And I guess the takeaway for most people is that you can train yourself to pass a job interview. If it's done like this with these, psychology 101 type questions. I think I've shown that on my YouTube channel for a lot of people, at least judging by the feedback I have. So don't read too much into this stuff. And, just if you're a candidate, learn to pass an interview. If you're a recruiter, learn how to actually assess people correctly. Learn some of the techniques they use to assess managers that are mid-level and up. Okay, a lot of true executive recruitment will be able to help with that. And a lot of people that work in true executive recruiting are people that were themselves, vice presidents of large organizations and things like this. Okay, so they know a lot how all this stuff works. So hang out with them and try and see what they do, okay? Because those techniques end up being much more effective if you really want to assess somebody. A lot of the stuff at the lower end, it's simply there to make it as quick and cheap as possible. But it shows. It's really not that effective. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I know this is probably going to divide people, but let me know what you think. And I may respond to some questions if I get something really interesting. So thank you very much for your attention. You guys are awesome. And I will see you on the next episode. Take care.